Everything you think you know about China is 30 years out of date. And the proof is a man in a Lexus on a Texas highway with a box of screws on the passenger seat. He made that drive 22 times. The most valuable company in the world was waiting on that box. What he ran into should frighten you more than any factory tour. Start with the obvious question. Why is a man delivering screws to a computer plant in his own car? The answer took 30 years to build. Stay with me, and you will find out what he was really up against, why it had almost nothing to do with cheap workers. These take a while to put together, so a like helps it reach more people, and subscribing means the next one finds you. Now, his trouble did not start with him. It started on television. In 2012, the head of Apple went on prime time and made a promise. The next Mac Pro would be built in America, Austin, Texas. It would carry a line on the case that no Apple product had carried in years, assembled in USA. For a while, it went fine. Components shipped in from China, the line went up outside Austin, and then the engineers did what engineers always do near the end of a project, which is change the design. Changes meant new parts. New parts meant somebody nearby had to make them. One of those parts was a screw, a custom screw, and they could not find anybody to make it. So the engineers started cold calling machine shops around Central Texas. Eventually somebody picked up. The shop that answered had about 20 people in it. The man who owned it had bought the place back in 2002, and here's the detail that makes this whole story ache. When he bought it, it could have done the job Apple wanted. It had the presses, big stamping machines, the kind that turn out screws by the truckload and do not much care how many you want. On the day he signed for that business, Apple's problem would not have been a problem. He could have run the order overnight and gone home. But that was 2002, and across the years that followed, the phone rang a little less, not dramatically, no single catastrophe, just fewer orders for high-volume parts, season after season, because the buyers who used to call had found somebody overseas who did it cheaper, and every one of those buyers was making a perfectly sensible decision. So he made a sensible decision too. He got rid of the presses. He put in machines for precise, specialized work instead, because that was the work still coming in. 10 years later, the phone rang, and it was Apple. Leave him standing in that shop for a minute, because to understand what he was actually up against, you have to go and look at the other side of the world, and you have to start where everybody starts. There was a woman working in a sock factory in a town called Datang. She ran 8 machines at once. Her son was being raised by his grandparents somewhere else, and she saw him once a year, at New Year. Millions of people made that trade. It was real, it was hard, and it is the picture almost everybody still carries around in their head when they think about Chinese manufacturing. That picture is a photograph of something that has already changed because the wages went up. Around 2011, a Chinese factory worker cost somewhere near $1.60 an hour, everything included. Today, the comparable figure is roughly 4 times that. Mexican labor is cheaper now. On the single number everybody argues about, China lost the argument years ago. So the factories should have left, that is what the theory says. Follow the cheap hands to Vietnam, to India, to Mexico, and the problem solves itself. Plenty tried, plenty came back, and the ones who stayed away kept discovering that their components were still arriving from China anyway. Something else was holding them there. To see it, take that same Texas emergency and run it again in Shenzhen. An engineer needs a part changed. It is Tuesday. He draws it. He walks it down the street to a workshop where somebody adjusts a machine that afternoon. The material comes from a supplier a short drive away. There is a man in the same district whose whole job is finding strange components before dinner. There is another who repairs that exact machine when it dies at 2 in the morning, and he lives 20 minutes from it. By Friday, there are samples on the table. By Monday, there are arguments about what to fix. Nobody in that version worked harder than the man in Texas. Nobody was cleverer. The difference is that everything anybody needed sat inside a 50-mile drive, while the man in Texas was on the phone, calling strangers, hoping someone picked. That 50 miles has a name, and once you know it, you cannot stop seeing it. Economists call it agglomeration. Put one industry in one place, and everything that industry needs piles up around it until the whole cluster moves faster and cheaper than any single company inside it could ever manage alone. You already believe in this, by the way. Films get made in Los Angeles. Money sits in New York. Software went to one valley in California. Nobody calls that a plot. It is just what happens when the specialists and the suppliers all end up within driving distance of each other. China did it to physical objects on purpose, and then took it further than sounds possible. There is a town called Kiao that makes the buttons, not some buttons. The buttons on shirts right now. Across most of the planet, there is the sock town, Datang, where the woman with the 8 machines was standing. Around places like these sit the dye houses, the machine dealers, the men who fix the machines, the freight agents, packed in tight for decades until the town stopped containing the factory and simply became one. They did not win on wages, they won on geography, which is a wonderful thing to build and a terrible thing to have taken off you. And the second one is what happened to that shop in Texas. The West did not lose manufacturing in one dramatic moment. There was no vote and nobody announced it. It went in a million small ones, and every single one of them looked exactly like an ordinary morning, where a buyer moved one component to a cheaper supplier for entirely good reasons. When a factory goes, the factory is the least of it. The engineer who knew how that machine behaved on a cold morning goes somewhere else. The tool shop that lived on its orders shuts. The material processor loses the volume that justified the equipment. The apprentice who would have learned the trade never gets hired, and 20 years later there is nobody left to replace the old man who retired. 2 Harvard professors put a name to this in 2009. They called it the Industrial Commons, the shared pool of skills, suppliers, and hard-won knowledge that no single company owns, that everybody in a region quietly draws from, and that dies once enough of them stop drawing. Economists have put the American job losses from Chinese competition at around 2 million across the whole economy in the years up to 2011. Those are the ones somebody counted. The presses that got sold, the trades nobody learned, the shops that quietly changed what they do, none of that appears in any figure anywhere. But it appeared in Austin. Because of course the shop said yes, it was Apple. The order was 28,000 screws. American shops of that size were working at something like 1,000 a day, on machines never designed for the job, and that was the honest ceiling. So he started making them. And rather than wait on a carrier, he loaded what he had into his own car and drove them over himself, an hour each way, 22 times. Sit with that image, because it is the entire story in one frame. The most valuable company on earth, a national promise engraved on the case. And a man in a sedan on a Texas highway, hand-delivering a job that a machine he used to own could have finished overnight. He delivered every screw he promised. And by then, it no longer mattered. The computer was ready for real production. Real production needed real volume, and Apple ordered the screws from China. Now this is where most people would end it, tell you the West is finished, and take the easy applause. I am not going to, because it is not true. And the reason it is not true was sitting on that man's shop floor the entire time. Look again at what he bought when he sold those presses. Machines for precise work, odd specifications, short runs, fast turnaround for people nearby. Then look at where China genuinely loses, because it does, reliably, and anybody who makes things for a living already knows this list. It loses on anything bulky. The moment your product is mostly air, or mostly weight compared to its value, freight swallows the entire saving, and a supplier 2 hours away beats a supplier 5 weeks away without trying. It loses on speed to the customer. A boat takes weeks. If your buyer needs it Thursday, the cheapest factory on earth is irrelevant, because it is in the middle of an ocean. It loses on paperwork, which sounds like nothing until it is everything. Anything certified, traced, and audited, where a regulator can demand to know which batch of steel went into which part on which day. And being wrong means a courtroom instead of a refund. And it loses on trust. Send a genuinely new design into a cloning economy, and you may meet it again under somebody else's brand before yours has even shipped. So here is what I actually think, and it is neither of the 2 versions you normally get handed. China is not unstoppable. The wage advantage is gone, the workforce is shrinking, and there are entire categories it cannot serve at any price. And China is not collapsing either, however many people have promised it every year for the last 15, because the thing holding it up was never the cheap workers everyone keeps trying to take away from it. One side spent 30 years compounding a system. The other side spent 30 years dismantling one. This is simply what compounding looks like when you are standing on the wrong side of it. And that is the genuinely frightening part. Not that China is strong, that nobody had to do a single thing wrong for this to happen. It was assembled out of 30 years of reasonable purchase orders, and it will not be undone by a slogan, or a tariff, or one factory with a ribbon across the door. It gets rebuilt the way it was lost. Slowly, boringly, one order at a time. If you got something out of this, hit the like button and subscribe if you want more of these.